right? And so if you actually look, because I used to be a population mortality expert, the longest life expectancies were centered right around the equator of the Earth. If you look at most of the blue zones, they're going to be sort of closer to the equator of the Earth. They're going to be closer to places where the sun shines longer periods of time throughout the year.
The blue zones?
The blue zones are areas of the world where people live extraordinarily long life expectancies, right? Mediterranean diets. So the longest life expectancies are centered around the equator. So for every 20 degrees latitude, because this is longitude, every 20 degrees latitude, there's a precipitous drop in life expectancy until you get to the poles, where when I started in this industry, the shortest life expectancy on Earth existed. So when I was born in 1970, a true Eskimo had a 56-year life expectancy. 56
An Eskimo
years.
had 56.
True Eskimo. So these are at the poles. Now, why? Because they would go months without seeing the sun. And when they did see the sun, they were layered up. So they had brittle bone disease, they had autoimmune disease, they had immunocompromised conditions, all kinds of conditions that go with severe depletion in vitamin D3. And so I would see this in the medical record all the time, right? I would see medical record after medical record. Patient has had a decade or longer of clinical deficiency in vitamin D3. Well, when you deplete this nutrient and you don't supplement for it, by the way, vitamin D3 is so easy to supplement for. Everybody should be taking vitamin D3 unless you're getting adequate sunlight. 5,000 IUs of D3 with 80 micrograms of K2. And you deplete this nutrient. Eventually, you will develop rheumatoid arthritis-like symptoms. Now, you don't have rheumatoid arthritis, but you have the same identical symptoms when you're depleted in vitamin D3. You start waking up sore and achy like you had a workout the night before when you haven't. The soles of your feet and your ankles are tender when you get out of bed in the morning to walk to the bathroom. Your knees and hips and ankles start to stiffen up. Then it goes to cross the shoulders, and eventually it's hard to make a really tight fist. Well, if you go to the wrong physician, family medicine practitioner that's seeing a lot of high volume of patients, you start to give them that description, they go, you know what? You got rheumatoid arthritis. I'm going to hit you with something called corticosteroids. I'm going to put you on some prednisone first, and then we're going to transition you to a corticosteroid like a methotrexate or one of these, and you're going to be fine. It's going to push this off into the future. Well, we knew that if you started corticosteroids, that at first they had an anti-inflammatory effect, but you had roughly 6 years and 1 day until you were having a joint replacement. Because first they're anti-inflammatory, but then they eat the joint like a termite. And so it was so accurate that if you were a 60-year-old female and you were misdiagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis because you had a vitamin D3 deficiency, I would artificially advance your age 6 years. I would schedule the joint replacement. That wasn't required, by the way. I would schedule the joint replacement, and then I would begin to reduce what's called your ambulatory profile, how well you ambulate, how well you move. And we know now that sitting is the new smoking, right? Sedentary lifestyle is the leading cause of all-cause mortality. And so as I start to reduce your ambulatory profile, I bring in all of the diseases that exacerbate with reduced motility. So if I back this up, you were diagnosed with a condition that you didn't have because you had a deficiency in a very simple nutrient. So then you were put on a medication that wasn't required. This caused you to have surgery that you didn't need because to replace a joint that wasn't initially going to be defective. This reduced your mobility, and it brought diseases forward that you never would have caught, and you died early from a condition you never would have had because you had a deficiency in a nutrient that was misdiagnosed, mistreated, and led to your early demise. And I could give you hundreds of examples like this, and this is why, if you look at the 2016 Harvard study, the 2019 Johns Hopkins study, medical error is the third leading cause of death.
Medical error?
Medical error.
Is that misdiagnosis?
Misdiagnosis. The average American over 50, 52, is on 5 prescription medications. These are synthetic chemical pharmaceuticals, right? And in a lot of cases, we don't know the long-term side effects of these. In a lot of these cases, we actually don't even know the mechanism by which they work. If you actually open the PDR that comes, the disclaimer that comes with a lot of these medications, you'll see that they say mechanism of action unknown. Well, it's a sleep medication. How does it make me sleep? I don't know. It just makes you sleep. But if you just put the right amino acid balance, in fact, I would bet my career you have this gene mutation. I will pay for your test if you don't. It's $599. It's a cheek swab you do once in your lifetime, and it will tell you if you have this gene mutation, COMT. And if you do, I'll tell you exactly what supplement to take, and it will become a permanent thing of your past.
What supplement should I take? Don't end your sentence there, Gary.
So it's called L-methionine.
Oh, I've heard
and you
of
take L-methionine, you take methylfolate, and depending on where the gene break is and how severe it is, you may add something called SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine. And these sound like fancy names. They're just fancy names for vitamins and amino acids. All of these are in your bloodstream right now. So when you look at the sequence of breaks that somebody has, then you can tell them exactly what supplement to take. When they take this supplement, their body's no longer deficient, right? Deficiencies over time express themselves as all kinds of things. There's a lot of people that can't reach elevated emotional states for any prolonged period of time. This is because mood and emotional states are recipes, just like a chef bakes a recipe. But if you went to a bakery chef and you said, you can bake whatever you want, you just can't use butter. Okay, it doesn't sound like a big deal. It's just one ingredient. But think of the number of cookies, pastries, pies, brownies, that it would affect. It would affect so many different recipes just by removing one ingredient. This is the same thing that happens in human beings. If you couldn't use serotonin to assemble mood, okay, now any emotional state that requires that neurotransmitter as a part of its structure, you can't assemble.
And as it relates to that mutation, when people hear the term mutation, they think of it as being something that's happened in me. And I'm maybe, one of a few that have that mutation. Mutation sounds like
it does sound. It doesn't sound like an alien's about to start.
Yeah,
like
but it sounds like my sister won't have it, and it's just me. Right?
Okay, so a gene mutation means that we get a copy of our genes from each parent, right? And then the copy of these genes is passed down to us, and we know most of us are familiar with basic genetics, eye color, skin color, detached earlobes, but there's nothing you can do with that information. So beyond your ancestry, whether you got Irish heritage or Native American Indian or what have you, I mean, those are, if you did a 23andMe, you'd be able to find your ancestry, which is also your genetic history. That's not actionable information. When you look at the genes of methylation, right, and there are several of them, I look at 5 majors and a few minors. When you look at the genes of methylation, these are the genes that code for how materials are taken into the body are refined into the usable form. And these are not mutations that you're going to suffer from, but what they do is they cause deficiencies to arise in the body. And it's this deficiency that leads to the expression of these conditions. And so when you can't adequately methylate neurotransmitters, you have a deficiency in a certain neurotransmitter. Any mood, any emotional state that requires that neurotransmitter, you can't assemble. If you have a deficiency in the ability to quiet the mind, then you have excess neurotransmitters in the brain, which cause it to stay in awakened state.
So that gene that is responsible for my loud mind when I go to sleep, do you have any idea the amount of people that have that particular gene?
Well, 44% of the world's population has a gene mutation called MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. This is a genetic mutation that impairs the ability to convert folate into methylfolate or folic acid into methylfolate. And that might not sound like a big deal, but folic acid is one of the most prevalent nutrients in the human diet. And the thing about folic acid is that folic acid is an entirely man-made chemical. Folic acid is not found anywhere on the surface of the earth. You can't find folic acid anywhere naturally in nature. And yet we give folic acid to pregnant women when they get pregnant because we tell pregnant women that folic acid prevents neural tube defects. Well, that's patently false. Folic acid doesn't prevent anything. Folic acid has to be converted first into tetrahydrofolate, then dihydrofolate, but eventually it becomes something called methylfolate. And that prevents a neural tube defect. Well, what if, like 44% of the population and 44% of women, this woman has this gene mutation and you give her folic acid, the man-made version of folate, and she can't convert it into methylfolate. This is where postpartum depression develops. And, I have not seen a single peer-reviewed published clinical study linking elevated levels of hormones in female pregnancy to postpartum depression. But if you give a woman that can't methylate folic acid 1,400% of the daily allowance of folic acid, and she can't break it down, then she goes nuts. And then eventually the pregnancy ends, the depression goes away, and so she blames it on the pregnancy, not on the vitamin. And, we do this over and over and over again. We have in the modern industrial world, we try to synthesize what occurs naturally in nature in a laboratory. There's 3 types of B12, right? Adenosylcobalamin, hydroxycobalamin, methylcobalamin. These forms of B12 occur naturally in nature. There's one that we make synthetically in a laboratory. It's called cyanocobalamin. We make it from hydrogen cyanide. It is useless in the human body. The human body actually has to take it and convert it into the active form of B12 called hydroxycobalamin. And so a lot of times the supplements that we're taking us are causing more harm than good. And we're taking them because a doctor said, well, I'm pregnant. My OBGYN told me to take this synthetic chemical called folic acid, which it's always beyond me why anyone would think that something that we make in a laboratory that's entirely synthetic, that isn't natural, that isn't found anywhere on the surface of the earth could ever be required for optimal health. I mean, just on its surface, that sounds strange to me. But, yet we do, and we don't understand this process of methylation. So once you understand where your genetic mutations are, where the genetic inability to refine raw materials is, you can go about targeted supplementing for that deficiency.
So you would recommend people take a genetic test to find out these answers, right?
I'd recommend everyone take that test once in their lifetime.
I'm in the camp that as humans, we're not broken. Like I
totally agree with you.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so whenever there's something going on in my body, or a way that I am, or a habit I have that I'm like, oh, why do I do that? I'm always trying to figure out the sort of, I guess, the ancestral reason why that might have helped me to survive, or what's going on. So when I hear mutation, it sounds a little bit like broken to me.
Yeah. So I shouldn't use we use the term mutation, but basically, in our ancestry, right, we pass on our entire genetic code, which a lot of that is hair color, eye color, skin color, our heritage. But we also pass on how our body refines certain raw materials. And it's not to say that it's good or bad or broken or fixed, but there are certain families and human beings that have an inability to refine certain raw materials. And if we could be aware of this, it is astounding what happens to human beings when you just give their body the raw material to do its job. Lots of people that have attention deficit disorder, have trouble sleeping, are also have trouble with prioritization. They just don't know it. They'll say things like, I work really well under pressure. Right? Most entrepreneurs say, I work really well under pressure. Do you say that? Okay. So
I only work when there is pressure.
Okay. So
I was that kid in school that would only do the test when, there was an hour left to go, or, the homework or whatever.
Yeah, so many entrepreneurs are that way. And when you say you work really well under pressure, physiologically what you're saying is, I lack the ability to set priorities internally. So I use external pressure to set my priorities. And why is that? It's because when you don't have the right methylated nutrients in the body, you lend equal weight to every thought that comes into your mind, right? So you could be working on, the deal, the joint venture business closing of a lifetime. Right, and you got the contract, and you have 45 minutes to get it back to your lawyer. The deal's permanently going to go away. This is a life-changing deal. You've waited for this your entire life. It's a very meaningful event. You're working your way through this legal document, and you look over at your phone, and there's an Instagram message, and you're like, "Oh, that's my neighbor's cousin's kid fishing in a lake. I wonder if he catches a fish." So you start looking at it, and you're like, "So he's still casting? No, he didn't catch it that time." Now, meanwhile, this has gone from 45 minutes to 35 minutes, and now it's down to 25 minutes.
Right, and so I had Nir Eyal on the podcast. He wrote a book called Indistractable, and he says we're creatures that we're not pleasure-seeking creatures. We're creatures that are avoiding discomfort, essentially.
I think that aging is the aggressive pursuit of comfort. Could not agree with you more.
Let's use Dana White as an example.
Okay.
Because the reason why I came across your work is because of a clip that involved Dana White, and I'm sure I know you get this a lot because I've seen you be asked about this in interviews. But for context, for anybody listening, I don't know where I was, or no, I know what happened. My friend sent into a WhatsApp group a clip of Dana White talking about you, and that's the clip that made me go down the rabbit hole.
Oh.
I watched that clip. I then did some research. I then watched a series of videos of you online talking about health, and I watched you asking audience members to stand up and name the health issue they were suffering, and you on the spot told them what was missing from their life, their diet, whatever it might have been. You kind of diagnosed them in a way of, and then I reached out to you on Instagram, and that's why you were here. But if we go back to the start of that, it was that story that Dana White told that had me so compelled to reach out to you. For anybody that doesn't know, and there will be some people that don't know, Dana White is the president of the UFC.
So Dana White is an example. I mean, he's just a celebrity example, but he is a shining example of the vast number of people, men and women in his age category, that have given up on the capacity to thrive. They've accepted that they have hypothyroid, hypertension, they wake up sore and achy in the mornings, that they don't have a response to exercise, they have a little bit of spare tire, they're brain foggy, they're on 3 or 4 medications. In his case, he was on 7 medications at the time, 3 of which were for blood pressure. He was on, I think a thyroid medication. He was also on, he's been very public about this, by the way. And again, I have to say, I'm not licensed to practice medicine, so it was my clinical team that came up with the diagnosis, and I communicated it to Dana. I do train physicians to read blood work and genetic testing, but I can't practice medicine. But the point is that when I met Dana, all he wanted to do was for me to predict his life expectancy. And I hadn't done that in almost 7 years. I left that industry for a reason. I don't do it anymore. There's no interest in predicting death anymore. I only have an interest in extending life. And, when Dana was only interested in me predicting his death, so I said, okay, for Dana White, I'll come out, I'll meet with you. I'll do a blood test on you, a gene test on you. I'll pull all your medical records, and I'll give you your life expectancy. But what I did was we went out and got his blood work and his gene test, and I was actually in bed at 1:30 in the morning when the lab was running his blood work. And I've had 7 life-threatening alert calls in the middle of the night, because when you drop blood work off at the lab runs it through the night. If they find a life-threatening alert, they call the account holder, right? So I owned the company. I was on the account. So LabCorp calls us at 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning, says, hey, we have a life-threatening alert on a patient. I was like, whoa. What's the patient's name? They said, last name's White. I said, Dana White? And they said, yeah. And I go, wow, what's the life-threatening alert? And they said, triglycerides are almost 800. Now, triglycerides is a measure of blood fat. Okay, it shouldn't be above 149. At 200 or 300, this is a cataclysmic level in the blood, especially in a fasted state. Okay, we pulled his blood in a fasted state. They weren't 400, they weren't 500, they weren't 600, they weren't 700, they were like 768. So they were, this is an enormous number. And so I said, okay, I need to get the blood work over to the, to the doctor. And when they sent the blood work into the portal, I then saw that he was insulin resistant. He was hyperinsulinemic. He was pre-diabetic. He had skyrocketing levels of cholesterol. He was hypertriglyceridemic. He was homocysteinemic. This homocysteine that I told you elevates and causes the blood vessels to constrict. He had all of these conditions. I literally at that moment booked a flight for 7:30 or 8:30 in the morning to head out and see him. And because I said I need to go see him in person. And I remember, I think his assistant called me, and I was at the airport, and she said, hey, Dana wants to know if his life expectancy's in. I go, well, I'm on my way to see him, so I flew out to see him, and I sat down with Dana. And when we talked about the blood work, I didn't even explain the levels. I explained the symptom. I did not know that he was on a CPAP machine, but I said, I am surprised that you can actually sleep through the night, because he was so hypoxic. Red blood cell count, hemoglobin levels. I'm surprised you can even sleep through the night without just waking up, choking, gagging. He's like, dude, I'm on a CPAP machine. I wake up every night. I throw up in the middle of the night. I throw up so much I'm losing my voice. And I said, this level of claudication, triglycerides in the bloodstream, I'm surprised you can even bend down and tie your shoes. That's not painful to tie your shoes. Not that it's not restrictive to tie your shoes. It's not painful. Like, it doesn't feel like the skin's going to peel off your legs. And he slammed his hand down. He was like, how did you know that? And I said, Dana, your level of brain fog and fatigue right now has got to be at a crushing level of fatigue. I don't know how. The only thing getting you through the day is your own stubborn willpower. And I'm surprised you can remember anything from 1 minute to the next. And his whole staff was like, dude, he's so forgetful. He passes out in meetings. He's sleeping in the planes. He's gagging, snoring. These were not things I necessarily knew about him. So I began to describe all the outcomes of these kinds of conditions. And I said, look, if you don't do what we're going to ask you to do for the next 10 weeks, based on this blood work and the medical records that we pulled for the previous 10 years and the demographic data we pulled for 10 years, you have a life expectancy of 10.4 years. For a 52-year-old man to realize that he's not going to make it out of his 60s